All right, let's continue. And in the second hour here this afternoon, let me share with you some examples. And let's start with the desire of ages. In the 1980s, Dr. Fred Veltman, a retired professor of New Testament at Pacific Union College, was invited by the Ellen White estate to study the literary dependency of Ellen White's book, The Desire of Ages, in relationship to other books that she may have borrowed from. We knew that in her library there were a fair number of books on the life of Jesus written by non-Adventists. And we wondered to what extent did The Desire of Ages depend upon these other literary sources. So we asked Dr. Veltman to do a study of this, to compare the book Desire of Ages with books, non-Adventist books, who were in the library of Ellen White. He selected 15 chapters at random. In fact, it's not him, somebody else selected them for him. And these 15 chapters were compared to other books using a scale of 7 levels of dependency for each sentence. So notice how the methodology. Every single sentence in these 15 chapters of Ellen White's book, The Desire of Ages, are compared with the other books who talk about the same chapter or the same topic. 15 chapters were selected, 5 short chapters, 5 long chapters, and 5 medium chapters. Altogether 15. And the criteria differentiating between these levels of dependency have to do with the amount of verbatim words that are found in these parallel sentences between Ellen White and the other author. So that was a very methodical research that was done. Very systematic, very tiny and slow going and mind-boggling probably too. Here are the 7 levels of dependency that Dr. Veltman came with. Level 7 is a sentence in Ellen White's book that is a strict verbatim sentence. That means that all words in that sentence are identical to all the words coming from another book. Level 6, only 1 or 2 words have been changed. Level 5, it's a very strict paraphrase. Very little has been changed. Level 4, level 3 are paraphrases too. Level 2 is a source Bible. Ellen White, quoted the Bible all the time. So sometimes there are sentences in The Desire of Ages that are quotes from the Bible. Well, we wouldn't say that that is plagiarism. So the source of that quote is the Bible. Sometimes there's very partial independence, barely perhaps 1 word. And then sometimes there are no dependence at all. So that's a level 0. So what Veltman did was that he took every single sentence in these 15 chapters and he compared them with the other books, and to each sentence he gave one of these levels. He assigned one of these levels to each of them, one by one. And then he did the arithmetic and the statistics and added it all up. Well, where's my graph? There it is. There were 2,647 sentences altogether. That's a lot of sentences. A strict verbatim, none whatsoever. Level 6, which means 1 or 2 words only have been changed in the sentence. He found 29 such sentences. Level 5, which is a very strict paraphrase, maybe 3 or 4 words are changed in the sentence. He found 183. Or 7% of those chapters. The other levels of 4, 3, 2, and 1, he found altogether 31% of those in the book. 0 dependence whatsoever, not a word that he could find. 61% of those chapters have no dependence. The average level of dependency is 3.3, which is a little higher than a loose paraphrase on those chapters. So that was a very methodical study, very slow, painstaking, looking at every details of all these sentences. That's the conclusions he came with on those 15 chapters, of course. Here's a conclusion that Dr. Veltman came to. While the investigation followed through on its initial method of research, in the final analysis it was not able to ascertain the extent of Ellen White's literary dependence, given the amount and variety of her writings and the limitations of time and research personnel. As far as he could conclude, these are his conclusions. But he could have used a whole lot more time, more personnel, compared with more books, maybe found something else. So he does not want to say, here's a percentage of what is borrowed. Nevertheless, there can be no longer any doubt that she used sources regardless of the subject content. And though there are many facets of her dependency that are yet to be explored, and questions about her borrowing that beg for answers, there is also something to be said about her independence and originality. The research clearly shows that the sources were her slaves, never her master. She readily recognized that expressions in her sources would enhance her writing and serve her purposes. Ellen White, with the aid of her literary assistants, built on the common quarry of stones, not a replica of another's work, but rather a customized literary composition which reflects the particular faith and Christian hope she felt called to share with her fellow Adventists and the Christian community at large. So these are Dr. Veltman's conclusions. You can read more of that in the encyclopedia, Ellen White Encyclopedia, when it comes out. I'm privileged to have the database with me, so I can quote if I, if I need to. Dr. Veltman wrote a couple of articles in the Ministry magazine some years ago that summarize his research. There are a lot of details and graphs and tables there with percentages and so on. Just do a little Google search, or even a search on the database here, the James White Library. Look for Ministry magazine, Dr. Veltman, Fred Veltman, you'll find the articles. Sorry that I don't have the references here with me. Let's take another example. This one is on the life of Paul. Ellen White's writing on the life of Paul expanded through the years like any other subject of Ellen White. She began to write on Paul in 1858 in the first volume of Spiritual Gifts, then in volume 3 of Spirit of Prophecy, then in number 8 of the Redemption series, and then the major book are Sketches from the Life of Paul, 1883, and then Acts of the Apostles as we know it in 1911. These are the writings that she wrote on Paul himself. Of course, she did write articles in the magazines, in the journals, but here in the book forms, here's what we have. Let me concentrate on the one before the last, Sketches from the Life of Paul. If there is one charge of plagiarism against Ellen White, it has to do with that book. More than any of the other books of Ellen White, that one is being accused of being a plagiarized book. The accusation is that she copied large sections from a work that is found in her library, Conybeare and Howson's The Life and Epistles of St. Paul. There are many editions of that little book, or not little, big book. You notice here that I'm giving you a reference, and that's the one I will use to give you examples of printed in New York in 1855. Just want to say the little anecdote that that is a plagiarized copyright because Conybeare and Howson are British. And the book is printed for the first time in Great Britain. But because American law does not recognize British law, Crowell took the book and published it himself and made money out of it. All right? Talk about copyright infringement. There's an advertisement for Conybeare and Howson's book that appears in the Signs of the Times in February of 1883. It was customary in those days that the Review and Herald office or the Signs of the Times office was some kind of a bookstore. And if they found good books by non-Adventists, they would buy them in stock and sell them through the Review. People would send in the money and they would package it and mail it to the folks. At the bottom corner of one of the pages in 1883 there, February of 1883 in the Signs of the Times, there's a little advertisement for Connie Berenhausen's book. And at the very end of that announcement, there is a quote from Ellen White. They have asked Ellen White's opinion on that book. And here's what she said. The Life of St. Paul by Connie Berenhausen I regard as a book of great merit and one of rare usefulness to the earnest student of the New Testament. Now that's what she says, that's her testimony, opinion regarding Connie Berenhausen's book. And what is that opinion? It's a good book. Buy it. And she's willing to put her name to the advertisement. Buy it. Go ahead. It's a good book. Now when is that advertisement being published? February 1883. When is the book Sketches from the Life of Paul coming out? June of 1883. So while her own book on the life of Paul is being, at the press, being put together, she's giving an advertisement and a recommendation to buy Connie Berenhausen's book in the pages of Signs of the Times. Now it's not hard to add facts together here. If she had wanted to hide the fact that she had borrowed from Connie Berenhausen in the publication of her own book, which is going to come out in a few weeks, do you think that she would have recommended Connie Berenhausen? Anybody today would certainly not do that. Certainly not do that today. Anybody today would hide, as far as possible, the sources of one's book or inspiration for a book. But that's not what she does. She recommends it. She says to the people, read it. And then her own book will come out in a few weeks. Well, let me give you some examples, as I promised you. I hope you can see here on the screen. On the left-hand column is the book by Connie Berenhausen. On the right-hand column is the similar paragraph coming from Ellen White's book, Sketches from the Life of Paul, and I'm giving you the pages there at the bottom. What I have done with Ellen White is that I have attempted to use Fred Veltman's levels of dependency, 0 to 7, and I have myself assigned in parentheses a number at the end of each of Ellen White's sentences. So that's my own work. That's my attempt at trying to understand what's going on. And here we see it. That is, these two chapters that I'm referring to here, and examples I'm taking from the two chapters, are when Paul is in Ephesus. Acts of the Apostles, chapters 18, 19, 20, thereabout. Paul goes to Ephesus, and you know the story. While he preaches the gospel there is these craftsmen that are producing these little temples of the goddess Diana. And because Paul is so successful at preaching the gospel, the sales go way down. And because of that, there's a riot. And people want to kill Paul and his disciples and so on. Well, Ellen White talks about these here in these chapters. And it is supposedly, the critique is that of all the plagiarized chapters of Ellen White, these two chapters are the most plagiarized of all from Connie Berenhausen. If you look at the Ellen White's paragraph here, or sentences, you see that there is a clear parallel between her paragraph and that of Connie Berenhausen. You see that the order of the thought is basically the same. It starts about talking about the statue of the goddess Diana, talks about some symbols on that statue. Then it goes about what do we do with these symbols? Well, sometimes if you pronounce them, they will accomplish wonders. If you write them, if you treasure them, they may be used as a charm, an amulet of some kind. And then she concludes by saying that numerous books and costly books had been written to try to explain these symbols. What's in red here is direct wording coming from Connie Berenhausen. It's obvious to me that when she wrote her own paragraph, Connie Berenhausen's book must not have been too far, because she follows basically the same order of thought. She's using her own words. She's paraphrasing a lot. But the order of the words, of the thought, is in the same order. She's using keywords also from Connie Berenhausen. Now we could say, she didn't have the book beside her. She'd never read the book. It's just a coincidence. That would be okay for one paragraph. That becomes a little more problematic if you continue to read. And paragraphs after paragraphs show some similarities of that kind. Here's another paragraph that I compare. The first sentence has no similarities. The second sentence, notice, there's only one word that is different. It's the word not. She puts the sentence in the negative while Connie Berenhausen have it in the positive. The next sentence is a very, very, very loose dependence. Then she talks about Moses and Aaron before Pharaoh. And she talks about magicians and miracles that were being performed and so on. Again, you see some kind of progression there that is the same. There are some wording, though, from Connie Berenhausen that she's not using. But the progression of the thought seems to be similar, in the same order, in the same sequence of events or sequence of talking about things. Here's another one. Much more here this time. The parallel is a whole lot more evident. This is talking about the fact that people came close to Paul and they were healed because the shadow of Paul touched some people. And so she begins to talk about these miracles and why miracles are happening in the early church. She talks about the hem of Christ's garment, who healed that lady that barely touched it. But look at the wording here. How the wording, the verbs, and some of the words are very similar to Connie Berenhausen. I've qualified that one as a 4. It is so close. But it's paraphrased a little. The next sentence is a whole lot closer. The next one too. And then the last one. So one sentence at the time. They're all in the same order and the wording is very close. So I've got to be honest here. When she wrote that paragraph or these paragraphs, Connie Berenhausen's book must have been close by. Must not have been far on her desk to be so similar. So there is a claim there. There is a validity there. What I am not showing you here, and I want you to note that and remember that, what I am not showing you in these slides are all the paragraphs and all the sentences where there is nothing taken from Connie Berenhausen in these chapters on the life of Paul. I'm not showing you these. I just want to show you the evidence that there is a parallel in some instances. But there are many instances where there are no parallels at all. Of course, if I had all the little details and the 2 chapters with me here on paper, I could show you where there are no parallels. I'm showing you the best examples where there are parallels. But keep in mind here that not all the chapter is like this. That not all the book is like this. But certainly here, we can see some evidences of parallel. Okay, you following? Hope I'm not blowing you away here, but it's obvious. There are some parallels. What are those details about? What are those details about? Sometimes, the first example or 2 I showed you, they had to do with the goddess Diana and the inscriptions on the goddess. Now maybe God showed those to her in vision, but she may not have understood all that, what is about. And so she got that history or chronology and all that stuff. She got it from Connie Berenhausen. In talking about the role of miracles, and well, here she's a whole lot closer. In this same chapter, she talks about the impact that the angels had behind the scenes in protecting Paul and his friends. Now, there's nothing in Connie Berenhausen that parallels this. When she goes behind the scene and talks about the events that are happening and the spiritual warfare, the great controversy that is going on, she says nothing there. What she says there has nothing to do with what Connie Berenhausen say. So those are points that we need to keep in mind. These 2 paragraphs that I've shown you, these 3 examples taken from 2 paragraphs, show that in many instances she borrowed or paraphrased keywords and expression from Connie Berenhausen. In Sketches from the Life of Paul, the borrowed material is estimated at about 12%. It was almost entirely limited to historical information, to background information, and was often rearranged by Ellen White to fit her own thought and her own chapter outline. She moved things around quite a bit. Whereas Connie Barrenhausen give little spiritual application and commentary of the events of Paul that Paul encountered, Ellen White emphasized the spiritual lessons to be gained from these events. They don't do that. She does. In these spiritual applications, she borrows very little from these earlier authors. And those are some of the examples I did not show you. When in 1911, Ellen White published an expanded edition on the life of Paul in Acts of the Apostles, she used even less material from Connie Barrenhausen. She added more of her own theological and practical commentary and very much less of Connie Barrenhausen. Now, why is that? It's because people had read both books and had talked to Sister White about it. And they had told her, Sister White, that's not proper. What you have done is a little too much borrowing here, and we feel a little uncomfortable with what you have done. And so she understood the message. She didn't know. She was not aware of these copyright things and copying and being deceitful and deceiving. She didn't want to do that. She was not aware of that, of these laws and ways of doing things like this. And so when she understood, she decided to do things differently. In a moment, at the very end, I'm going to show you a quote from W.C. White where he talks about what's happening here with the life of Paul. Let me go on to another example. This one has to do with Ellen White's thought on inspiration. Now, this example is what I qualify to be the best example, because it will show you something that the other examples have not shown. You know that Ellen White wrote on the subject of inspiration. In 1886, she wrote a manuscript that was published much later in Selected Messages, Volume 1. It is a manuscript that you are very well aware of. You have heard these comments before. But what people seldom know is that many of them were borrowed from a book written by Calvin Stowe in 1867 on the origins and history of the books of the Bible. Let's look at, again, a parallel, two paragraphs side by side. I'm not giving you the whole manuscript of Ellen White. It's way too long. But I'm giving you the best example from that copying, borrowing that is happening here. And this one, hang on to your seats. Here it is. Stowe is on the left, Ellen White is on the right. And you see an awful lot of red in Ellen White, don't you? Here is the paragraph that you have read and heard over and over. It is not the words of the Bible that are inspired, but the men that were inspired. Inspiration acts not on the man's words and to his expressions, but on the man himself, who, under the influence of the Holy Ghost, is imbued with thoughts. But the words receive the impress of the individual mind. The divine mind is diffused. The divine mind and will is combined with the human mind and will. Thus the utterances of the man are the word of God. You remember that paragraph? You've heard that before? I mean, I've quoted it earlier in the semester when we talked about inspiration. Did you know that all these words came from somebody else? You never knew that. They're all in red. Most of that paragraph is in red. It is borrowed directly, word for word, almost, from Calvin Stowe, one of his chapters. But what you don't know is that what she did not take from Stowe. The wording is taken from Stowe. It is very obvious. The wording is taken from Stowe. But she did not borrow the theological thoughts of Stowe on the concept of inspiration. And I want you to note that. And that is what is most amazing in this paragraph. The wording is that of Stowe. I agree. The thought is not of Stowe. All right, so let's do some revelation inspiration here. Follow along with me. Let's read what Stowe wrote. It is not the words of the Bible that were inspired. It is not the thoughts of the Bible that were inspired. Did she agree with that? No, she does not agree with that. She does not agree with that because she believes that when God inspires the prophets, what is it that is inspired? The thought, the thinking of the author, of the prophet. God gives, as I've said, a video clip. Impressions are given, thoughts are given into the mind of the prophet. Stowe says no. The inspiration is not on the words, it's not mechanical, and it's not on the thoughts. It's not in the mind of the prophet either. It is the men who wrote the Bible that were inspired. All right? But what does he mean by that? Inspiration acts not on the man's words, not on the man's thoughts. Did she agree with that? No, she did not copy those words of Stowe. So she's beginning to diverge from Stowe's thinking about inspiration. But inspiration acts on the man himself, so that he, by his own spontaneity, note that, his own spontaneity, we become very subjective here, under the impulse of the Holy Ghost, conceives certain thoughts and give utterance to them in certain words, both the words and the thoughts receiving the peculiar impress of the mind, which conceived and uttered them, and being in fact just as really his own as they could have been if there had been no inspiration at all in the case. Inspiration generally is a purifying and an elevation, an intensification of the human intellect subjectively, rather than an objective suggestion and communication, though suggestion and communication are not excluded. The divine mind is, as it were, so diffused through the human, and the human mind is so interpenetrated with the divine, the utterances of the man are the words of God. But that, for the time being. Stowe's view of inspiration is what is called the encounter view of inspiration, similar to Barth and Brunner of the 20th century. He is a forerunner of Barth and Brunner in the understanding of inspiration. Stowe believes that when the Holy Spirit inspires a prophet, he does not give to the prophet objective information like words, like thoughts, like images. What does he give? He gives an impression, a subjective impression that he says there. It's an elevation, intensification of the divinity, there's a connection that happens there. So that the words that the prophet will express are his spontaneity, his feelings, his impression of what God is trying to tell him. There is no objective communication, again I say, of words, of thoughts, or images. It is all subjective impressions. And from those, he writes the message that we now have in Scripture. Is that Ellen White's thought of an inspiration? Not at all. Not at all, not at all. That is not her view of inspiration. She believes that God does communicate objective information. Sometimes it's words, but sometimes it's an image, flashlight scenes, video clips. God communicated images to Ellen White. And these images gave her content, something to write about, some things to say. She saw something and so she wrote about it. That's not what Stowe says happens. The prophet does not see things. He does not hear things. He feels something and then he writes about it. That is not Ellen White's view of inspiration. So my friends, in writing that manuscript for herself, by the way, she did not write that manuscript to print it. She wrote it for herself, like she did many times. In writing that manuscript, she very likely had just read Stowe's chapter on that subject. She very likely had been reading that. She had the book beside her, and she began to write her own view of inspiration. But she used his wording. She used his words, but she did not use his thoughts. Now tell me, She's not a theologian. She's not clever. She's not smart enough to know the difference. Which one of us, honestly here, before we took any theological courses, could have written on inspiration and made that distinction? Tell me, which one of us? I don't think many. I don't think many. I don't think I could. I don't think I could. But she knew how God worked with her. She knew how God communicated things to her. And she wanted to say it her way. She used His vocabulary. I admit that. We need to admit that. She used His vocabulary. But was she mindless, copying mindlessly the thoughts of somebody else? No, she was not. No, she was not. So people may use that example and say she's a plagiarist. And I say, wait a moment here. Wait a moment. She's not a plagiarist. The wording, yes, but not the thought. Okay, now I need to be honest with you though. Were you to do that today? All right? Were you to do that today in a term paper without giving proper references and you were found out, there would be questions asked. Yes, by comparing, we professors would find out you've got different thinking. The wording is very similar, but you're not thinking the same way. So the accusation of plagiarism would not be there, but you would certainly raise eyebrows on the part of your professors. You certainly would. Okay, so today's today. 100 years ago is 100 years ago. We need to keep that in mind here. We need to keep that in mind. But I want to emphasize, she is not mindlessly copying. She's not doing that. The next few slides, I'll take your questions in a moment. The next few slides simply summarize what I just said about Brunner, Karl Barth, Stowe's understanding, and so on, and how she viewed inspiration. The three next following slides are basically explaining that, what I just said. Let me take a couple questions, then I'll wrap it all up. David.
Yeah, the passion you just showed us from Stowe, was she, on top of what she was writing about inspiration, was she, at the time when she was writing it, inspired?
We believe she is. She was making the difference between the two. God was guiding her in selecting what to take, what not to take. That is part of the gift of inspiration. We say that, yes, that she was inspired. And what I'm going to show you next is a letter, or parts of a letter, of W.C. White about what is Ellen White doing in this kind of process. And that is his take on it. Yes. Paul, same question. Kyle.
Now, if I was reading something on my own and writing after it, maybe an hour later, notes in my journal, oh, this is an interesting idea.
Yes.
Now, I know myself, I take a tendency to write the same words because they're in my mind.
That's right. That's right.
So this manuscript
Is something like that.
I mean, this is a journal she was writing,
Yeah.
trying to capture thoughts.
Yes.
So we can't even say with intent she was trying to publish this.
No, she was not. She was not intending to publish this. You're right.
So that argument to me just completely falls flat on the ground.
Yeah.
I mean, this is just writing in your journal.
That's right.
I can clearly do that any day of the week.
Yeah, and we need to be mindful of that thought. There's a very good point of information there regarding this. But I want to emphasize the idea that she was able to compare. She was able to think things through. Andrew?
I was wondering if Ellen White was
Louder.
if Ellen White was a prophet, as some of us claim, and has received direct revelation from God in certain theological issues, why was there a need to rely on some other guy's vocabulary when she could have come up with her own in a different way? Because in a critical circle, if you go outside of the Adventist circle, this argument does not stand.
Well, the answer to that, good question. I don't know if everybody heard it. Why would she go to get somebody else's person's vocabulary? Well, there are a few reasons that we've seen so far in the semester. One of them is that she felt weak in her own mastering of the English language. She felt like at times she was not at par to express some of these ideas, and so she needed to go somewhere else to get that information and to get some ways of saying it. She tells us in the introduction to The Great Controversy that when she saw that some people wrote things in a very convenient manner, very succinct, she would borrow this because she felt comfortable doing that. She felt it was reflecting what she was trying to say. She did have only a third grade formal education after all. Of course, she was educated more than that, but she felt her sense of limitations. That's one of the answers that she has given.
I accept the answer, but it's just it gives room for speculation.
I know it gives room for speculation. That's why I'm being candid with you. I'm not brushing this under the carpet here. She has done these things. She did borrow. You see evidences there. And I'm giving you just a couple things. Sketches from the life of Paul and then this manuscript. I could give you a whole lot more examples from all over the place. But I think what counts now is to try to understand the process and how she did things. And she was not mindless in doing this. I want to ask the question again. What would she do today? You know, that's the question I think that is relevant also. What would she do today were she alive today? Would she use her sources in the same way as she did in her time? Would she copy the same way? Would she borrow the same way? I would say no. What leads me to say that? And the next slide will explain. Would she be more aware of her uncredited use of sources? Would she be more willing to give proper references? I say yes, she would. And here's why. Leroy Froome, who was a seminary professor at some time, wrote to W.C. White and asked to explain some of these things because he had found out some of those things. And he wanted him to give some kind of an explanation because he was disturbed. In many of her manuscripts, W.C. White wrote, as they come from her hand, quotation marks are used. In other cases, they were not used. And her habit of using parts of sentences found in the writings of others and filling in a part of her own composition was not based upon any definite plan, nor was it questioned by her copyists and copywriters, that means her assistants, until about 1885 and onward. Let me pause there. She has had a habit of writing books in which she will give quotation marks and in which she will not give quotation marks. And that habit of doing this began to be questioned by her copyists, meaning her assistants who copied her manuscripts, who wrote them, and so on. About what year? That's when? That's 2 years after the publication of what book? Sketches from the Life of Paul. The folks around Ellen White who had read Connie Berenhausen and had read Sketches from the Life of Paul saw the similarities. And they said to Sister White, something is not adding up here. You should not do it that way. You should give references. If you give quotation marks, or if you don't, you should, and you should give references. So people began to point that out to Ellen White after 1885. When critiques, notice the next sentence. When critiques pointed out this feature of her work as a reason for questioning the gift which had enabled her to write this. What's the accusation? Sister White, we're having doubts about your prophetic gift because of the way you write your books, i.e., Sketches from the Life of Paul. Sister White, we're having problems here. We're questioning whether you're a genuine prophet. What did she respond? She said, I don't get the point. She said, I don't see what you're trying to talk about. I don't get the point. I don't know what you're saying. She paid little attention to it. Later on, when complaint was made that this was an injustice to other publishers and writers, she made what? Decided change. Now there's a switch here that happens. And let's look at it. Let me go back to the prior sentence. When critiques pointed out this feature of her work as a reason for questioning the gift which had enabled her to write. She paid little attention to it. What's happening here? People are questioning whether she has the prophetic gift. She says, that's your problem, that's not my problem. That's your problem, that's not my problem. The way I write my books is because that's the way I feel, I think I should write them. That's your problem if you have any problems with this. You're following? Next sentence, later on, when complaint was made that this was an injustice to other publishers and authors. Now that's a moral issue. That's an issue of integrity. That's an issue of lying. That's an issue of being deceitful. That's an issue of you are damaging somebody else's reputation. What did she do? She changed. She says, oh, okay, now that's my problem. She says, now that's my problem. I cannot damage somebody else. I cannot hurt somebody else. I cannot be lacking integrity. I cannot be doing that. I mean, if people think I'm a liar or I'm damaging somebody else, she thinks here, I can't do this. A change which you are familiar with, he continues. It is my belief, Brother Froome, that I cannot too frequently restate the fact that Sister White's mind was keenly active with reference to the contents of the articles published in our periodicals and the chapters composing her books, and that she had help from heaven and was remarkably acute in detecting any error made by copyists and by copy editors. So in other words, when she borrowed from other authors, she knew what she was doing. She did it with mind, with very active in the process. She was not mindlessly copying. Does this help?
Yes.
Were she to live today, would she do things differently? I think she would. I have confidence that she would, because I see the process here that has happened in her own ministry. Sketches from the Life of Paul is the last book she wrote that way. The other books, she borrowed a whole lot less from them. And if she borrowed, she paraphrased a whole lot more. She was careful to do it that way. She wanted to be careful. Were she to be alive today, I think she would make even more changes and would make references and give the authors that she borrowed from. She would let us know who they are. Maybe in the preface, maybe in footnotes, who knows. But she would give references. Already this third edition of the Great Controversy, 1911, at the very end, there's an appendix there, and it is full of notes that she wanted added to support what she had been saying, to give more references to what she had been saying. So as time went on, she acted more like a scholar in writing some of the books that she did. Hope this helped. Ellen White was fully engaged in the process of redaction of her books. She did use external material not in lieu of her own thought, but to enhance the expression of her thought. She made references to other authors, but openly invited people to read those books she made references to. I don't think she was a plagiarist. She borrowed honestly within the culture of her time, and I think we still can have confidence in the books that she wrote. All right, let me take, there were a couple hands there. Troy, Evelyn.
Well, I was just wondering about our academic process today. If I write something, not strictly write my opinion, and don't have any kind of, even if I cite the authorities, if I don't give quotations and references where I got my stuff from, nobody listens to me.
That's true.
I mean, if I write right now, I can write 20 pages and give my theological perspective, but if I don't cite somebody from outside of myself, from this seminary or somewhere else, they say that's no good. But here, she does what is expected today, and then people accuse, even though she didn't give references, but she used other authorities, and it seems backwards to me.
Oh, a little twist to it, isn't it?
Yeah.
Okay, you're having a good thought there. Evelyn?
Well, I was just looking at this to address my brother's question here. Why did she need to go to other sources of secular artists, writers or whatever, non-Adventists, or even if they're Adventist writers? If we look at the Gospels, we see a number of things occur. Number one, Luke is open that he is using sources. John isn't open, but John chapter 1 is all using phrases from other sources, and we don't question many textual critics today are tearing apart the Gospels and no longer believe that Jesus, is anything because they look at this and they just say, well, all he's doing is redacting other people's work and just quoting. And this, we look at Matthew, Mark, and Luke, and look how they've been thrown together.
That's right.
And we've teared them apart. There's no difference with what we're doing here when we question, well, why does she have to use other sources? Why did Jesus use other sources?
And Luke did the same, and that's right. Some Old Testaments also, our writers did the same. That's right. And we uphold their inspiration and their validity and the message that they bring.
Yes. Is
That's
Jesus, his parables,
That's
his
right.
sayings, are those inspired if they're direct quotes from other rabbis?
Of course, we say yes, of course they are. By all means, yes.
I just wanted to respond to what Troy was saying. I think it's a good observation that is made. But I guess the difference is that people have an expectation
Yep.
that, okay, a prophet, you're not using any sources, you're just communing directly with God. So when they use other sources, people's understanding of how a prophet should work is kind of thrown out of line.
That's right.
So it goes back to understanding how a prophet should work.
And it goes out to understanding how inspiration works too. That's right, how the work of a prophet is. All of these criticisms of plagiarism are all framed, very often, very framed within this mechanical verbal inspiration. And if that's the model that people approach the work of a prophet with, then no wonder it does not add up. But that was not Ellen White's understanding of inspiration. So that's a very good comment. Well, let me pause here for today.